The moment Eudora Rhodes pushed open the doors of the Grace Fellowship Church in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, every single soul inside felt the temperature of the room shift, as though the devil himself had sent a messenger and dressed her in trail dust and desperation. She was not the kind of woman who walked quietly into any room. Even now, with her dark hair wind-tangled and her riding coat powdered gray with the dust of 3 hard days on the road, even with the circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and the tight set of her jaw that told of a woman who had learned long ago not to ask for help, she was the kind of woman who made men forget their own names. She was 27 years old, and she had lived more lives than most people managed in 60 years, and every single one of those lives showed somewhere in the lines of her face and the careful economy of how she moved. She chose the very last pew, the very last one, pressed against the back wall, where the shadows pooled longest, and where the door was close enough that a woman with fast feet could be out of it in 3 heartbeats if something went wrong. She had learned to always sit near exits. She had learned a great many things that women in finer circumstances never needed to learn. The church was modest but well kept, the kind of building a small frontier town builds when it is trying to convince itself it has arrived at civilization. White-painted walls, plain glass windows, simple wooden pews that had been sanded smooth and oiled against the dry Kansas weather. There were perhaps 40 people gathered for the Sunday morning service, which was not bad for a town the size of Caldwell, which sat just a handful of miles from the border of Indian Territory, and served as the end point of the Kishom Trail, a place where cowboys came to spend money they had earned driving longhorn cattle up from Texas through months of punishing work. The preacher was already mid-sermon when she slipped inside. He was standing at the pulpit with his coat off and his sleeves rolled to his elbows, which she had not expected. He was not old, which she also had not expected. She had imagined when she pushed open the door that she would find some silver-haired deacon droning scripture at a half-sleeping congregation. What she found instead was a man who looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples, because the Kansas spring was already warm enough to make a man sweat through his collar. He had strong hands that moved when he spoke, not wildly but purposefully, as though the words he was saying needed to be shaped in the air to be properly understood. His name, though she did not yet know it, was Abraham Rourke. He had come to Caldwell 2 years prior from a small town in Tennessee, where he had grown up the son of a schoolteacher and a woman who believed with her whole heart that the Bible was not a weapon but a lantern. He had studied theology at a small college in Nashville, had been ordained at 25, and had answered the call for a frontier preacher with a combination of genuine faith and restless energy that made him suited for it in a way that perhaps a more sedentary man would not have been. He had buried cowboys who died in saloon fights. He had performed weddings at dawn before cattle drives pulled the grooms away south. He had sat with dying men and helped them write letters to families they would never see again. He was 32 years old, and he was, by any measure, a good man, which is not as common as people like to pretend. He was preaching on the subject of mercy. Not the soft, easy kind of mercy that people grant when it costs them nothing, but the hard kind, the inconvenient kind, the kind that requires a person to look at something uncomfortable and choose grace over judgment anyway. Eudora settled into the back pew and told herself she was only resting her feet. She had ridden hard from Dodge City, where a deputy by the name of Calvin Hurst had pinned a paper with her face on it to the board outside the sheriff's office. The drawing was not particularly good, but it was recognizable enough, and the reward printed below it, $200, for questioning in connection with the robbery of the First Merchants Bank of Wichita, was enough to make bounty hunters interested. It was also, she had noticed with a bitterness that had by now become familiar, not enough to suggest that anyone actually believed she had done it. If they truly thought her guilty, the number would have been higher. She had not robbed the First Merchants Bank of Wichita. She had, however, been present when it was robbed, and she had been riding with the man who had done it, which was close enough to guilty in the eyes of Kansas law to make her wanted for questioning, and close enough to guilty in the eyes of bounty hunters to make her worth chasing. The man who had actually robbed the bank was named Cole Danner, and Cole Danner was charming and reckless, and had convinced Eudora for approximately 8 months that he was the kind of man worth following. She had followed him across 2 states, and into a kind of trouble she had never planned on and could not now easily get out of. Cole Danner had been shot and killed outside of Wichita by a Pinkerton man 2 weeks after the robbery. This fact had not cleared Eudora's name. It had only removed the one person who might have testified that she had stood outside on the street holding horses while he went inside, that she had not known what he was planning, that she had screamed at him afterward in the dark outside of town while the horses drank from a creek and told him she was done, that she wanted no part of whatever he had become. She had told herself afterward that she had known, somewhere deep in the part of her that she usually kept very quiet, that something was wrong with Cole Danner, that the charm had always covered something hollow. She had told herself this, and it had not made her feel better. Abraham Rourke said, "The woman in this story did not ask to be caught in that situation. She was caught, the same way all of us get caught sometimes, between what we intended and what came to pass. And Jesus did not ask her about the distance between those 2 things. He asked the accusers about their own distance." Eudora went very still. She had not been listening particularly carefully. She had been watching the door and watching the congregation and cataloging the exits with the automatic wariness of someone who had been running long enough that wariness had become her default state. But those words reached her anyway, the way certain words do when they are the exact words a person needed to hear and did not know it. She looked at the preacher. He was looking at the congregation, not at her. He had not yet noticed her, or if he had not indicated it. He was speaking about the woman caught in adultery, the one the Pharisees brought to Jesus, and he was doing it without any of the condescension that Eudora had heard in similar sermons from other preachers, men who used that story as an opportunity to remind women of their weakness rather than to illuminate anything true about grace. He said, "There are people in this world who have been defined by one moment, by one mistake, or by one association, by being near the wrong thing at the wrong time. And there are people in this world who are very happy to keep them defined that way, because it is easier than doing the hard work of seeing a full human being." One of the women in the congregation, a stout woman in a brown dress with excellent posture, shifted in her pew in a way that suggested she found this somewhat personally challenging. Eudora almost smiled. Abraham Rourke continued preaching, and the service moved through its hymns and its prayers, and Eudora sat in the back pew and told herself she would leave before it ended, that she would slip out quietly and ride north toward the Nebraska line where she had a distant cousin who owed her a favor. But the pew was solid and the church was cool, and she had not slept properly in 4 days, and somewhere in the middle of the second hymn, her body made the decision her mind would not, and her shoulders dropped a half-inch and some of the rigid wire that had been holding her upright for days loosened, just slightly, just enough to feel what exhaustion actually felt like beneath the adrenaline. She stayed. When the service ended and the congregation began to rise and speak to one another in the friendly, low-voiced way of people who see each other every week, Abraham Rourke stood at his pulpit and looked out over the room, as he always did, checking that everyone had what they needed, checking the temperature of his small community the way a good shepherd does. He saw her then. He saw the woman in the last pew who had not moved with the rest of the congregation, who was sitting very still in the way that people sit when they are calculating whether to run or stay, who wore trail dust, and a look he recognized, because he had seen it before on the faces of cowboys who came into his church on a Sunday not because they believed in anything, but because they needed somewhere to sit for an hour that was not a saloon and not a bunkhouse and not the open sky. He had seen it on the faces of women whose husbands had brought them west and then died of fever or drought or bad luck, leaving them alone in a landscape that did not care about them. It was the look of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and did not know how to put it down. He came down from the pulpit and walked to the back of the church, nodding to the last of his congregation as they filed past him with their handshakes and their small news. And when the church had emptied, he stopped in the aisle beside the last pew and looked at the woman who had not left. He said, "Stay right there," not as a command, as a reassurance. As a man who has seen a deer in a clearing and does not want to startle it. Eudora looked up at him with eyes the color of strong tea, sharp and wary, and beneath the wariness, very tired. She said, "I was just leaving." "I know," he said, "but you have been just leaving for about 20 minutes and you are still here, so I thought I would come and make the decision easier for you." She stared at him. "What decision is that?" "Whether to ask for help," he said simply, and sat down in the pew in front of her, turning so that he was half facing her, leaving the aisle open and the door visible behind him, because he was the kind of man who thought about things like that without being asked. Eudora Rhodes had not, in a very long time, been offered anything without a string attached to it. The offer of help from a stranger was so far outside her current experience that her first instinct was pure suspicion. She said, "I don't know what you mean." "You are welcome to say that," he said. "It is not going to change the fact that you rode hard to get here, have not slept in a few days by the look of things, and are sitting in the last pew of my church because you needed somewhere to stop." She said nothing. He said, "My name is Abraham Rourke. I am the pastor here. There is a kitchen behind the vestry that has a stove and a pot of coffee that will still be warm. And I expect there is bread from yesterday if Mrs. Hensley left any, which she usually does. You are welcome to both without having to tell me a single thing about yourself." There was a long silence. Outside, the Kansas wind moved through the cottonwood trees that lined the street, and inside the church it was very quiet, and Eudora Rhodes sat in the last pew and looked at Abraham Rourke and tried to find the angle, the thing he wanted, the catch. She was very good at finding those things. She had been doing it since she was 15 years old, and her father had lost the family farm in Missouri to a bad harvest and 2 years of debt, and the world had made it very clear that there was always a catch. She could not find one. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you are a person and you are hungry and tired, and that is sufficient reason." She said, "You do not know who I am." He said, "No, I do not. I know you sat in the back of my church on a Sunday morning and that you listened carefully to a sermon about mercy, and that is more than I know about most people who come through the doors." Something in her chest moved in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. She said, "I have been known to be a considerable amount of trouble." He said, "The Apostle Paul was a considerable amount of trouble before he was anything else, and we named half the books of the New Testament after him, so I expect I can manage." Despite herself, despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the fear and the habit of wariness that had calcified over years into something almost structural, Eudora Rhodes laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, but it was genuine. Abraham Rourke smiled, and the smile rearranged his face in a way that she noticed and then immediately told herself she was not noticing. She said, "All right, coffee." The kitchen behind the vestry was small and warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something faintly floral that turned out to be a bunch of dried lavender hanging from a nail above the window, left there by someone who had thought the preacher's kitchen ought to have something pleasant in it. There was indeed bread, half a loaf wrapped in cloth, and there was butter in a crock and coffee in a blue-speckled pot on the back of the stove. Abraham Rourke poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the small table and sat across from her and did not ask her anything. He talked instead about the town. About Caldwell, which was in the middle of its busiest year as a cattle town, with the drovers coming up from Texas and the buyers coming down from the northern ranges, and the whole complicated, exhausting economy of the cattle trade passing through this single point on the map. He talked about the Indian Territory to the south, about the way the border had changed the character of the town, about the people who lived there, the families trying to build something permanent, and the transient population that never stayed more than a season. He was good at talking in a way that asked nothing of the listener, that offered information without requiring exchange. She recognized it as a skill and respected it. She ate the bread and drank the coffee, and gradually, bone by bone, the rigid posture that she had been holding for days began to soften. After a while she said, without particularly planning to, "My name is Eudora Rhodes." He nodded. She said, "I suspect you may have heard it before." He said, "Caldwell is not a large town. People talk. I have heard a name on the wind this past week." "Yes," she said, "and you still offered me coffee." He said, "I offered you coffee before I knew your name. I do not intend to take it back now." She looked at him across the small table with the morning light coming through the window and the lavender hanging above it, and she said, "You should know that I did not do what they say I did." He said, "I did not ask." She said, "I know you did not. I am telling you anyway, because I find that I would like you to know it." There was a quality to the silence between them after she said that, a quality that was different from the silence before. It was the silence of two people who have just said something true and are sitting with it. He said, "Then I believe you." She said, "You do not know me well enough to believe me." He said, "I know that you rode into Caldwell on a Sunday morning and went to church. I know that you sat in the back and you listened. I know that you could have been gone twice over before I finished talking, but you stayed. Those things tell me something about a person." She looked out the window at the cottonwood leaves moving in the wind. She said, "Cole Danner robbed that bank. I was outside. I did not know he planned to do it, and when I found out I left him. He is dead now, and there is no one to say that I was not inside, that I did not plan it, that I did not want any of it. There is only a wanted poster with a drawing that looks enough like me to make things difficult." Abraham Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have anywhere to go?" She said, "I have a cousin in Nebraska." He said, "Is the cousin expecting you?" She said, "Not exactly." He said, "Eudora," and her name in his mouth, spoken with simple directness and no performance, was startling to her in a way she could not have explained. She looked at him. He said, "I know a man. His name is Judge Harold Fenwick, and he rides circuit out of Topeka. He is an honest man and a fair one, which I know because I have known him for 2 years, and I have never seen him be otherwise. If your situation is as you describe it, and a man with credibility stands beside you and tells what he knows of your character, it is worth presenting to Fenwick rather than running to Nebraska and spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." She said, "You do not know my character. You met me 40 minutes ago." He said, "Then stay long enough that I do know it, and I will tell Fenwick what I know honestly." She stared at him. She said, "You are asking me to stay in Caldwell." He said, "I am suggesting it as an option." She said, "There is a wanted poster with my face on it." He said, "There is a deputy in this town by the name of Garrett Clay who is a reasonable man. He is not a bounty hunter and he is not looking for headlines. If I speak to him, he will give you time." She said, "You would do all of this for a woman you do not know." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table, and looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and he said, "I would do it for a person who is being pursued for something they did not do, because that is wrong regardless of who they are. And I would do it for you specifically, because you walked into my church this morning and sat in the back pew, and you did not leave when you could have. And something tells me, Eudora Rhodes, that you have been doing the right thing in hard circumstances for a long time, and you deserve to have someone do right by you for once." The spring sunlight came through the kitchen window. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, Caldwell was waking up to its Sunday routine. The saloons that had closed for the morning hour out of deference to the church service, beginning to reopen their doors to the trail hands, and the locals who were not particularly interested in deference. Eudora Rhodes sat in a preacher's kitchen in Kansas and felt something she had not felt in so long that she had begun to wonder if it was something she had invented, a faint warmth in the chest like a fire that has been banked for a long time and is now slowly being given air. She said, "All right." He said, "All right, you will stay." She said, "All right, I will think about staying. Do not rush me." He smiled again, and she looked away because it was easier. The arrangement that emerged over the next 2 days was this. Eudora would stay in the small room above the millinery shop, owned by a widow named Mrs. Clara Voss, who was a member of Abraham's congregation, and who, when Abraham spoke to her privately about the situation, said, "Bring her along, Abraham. I have been needing someone to help with the inventory anyway." With the pragmatic generosity of a woman who has survived enough hardship herself to know that generosity is a practical matter more than a sentimental one. Abraham spoke to Deputy Garrett Clay on the Monday morning, and Garrett Clay, who was a rangy man of 40 with a mustache like a horse's tail and eyes that missed very little, listened to everything Abraham said, chewed on a toothpick for a moment, and said, "I will not go looking for trouble, Abraham. But if a bounty man comes to town with her name, I cannot hold him off forever." Abraham said, "I know. I am writing to Judge Fenwick today." Garrett said, "Write fast." Abraham wrote fast. Eudora, meanwhile, helped Mrs. Voss with her inventory, which involved counting bolts of fabric and ribbons and various implements of sewing, and learned that Mrs. Voss had come to Kansas from Ohio 17 years earlier with a husband who had died of cholera in 1871, and 2 sons who were now grown and gone, one to Denver and one to Abilene, and that she ran her shop with considerable efficiency and a blunt warmth that Eudora found unexpectedly comforting. Mrs. Voss did not ask Eudora about her history. She did ask whether Eudora could sew, and when Eudora said she could manage basic things, she handed her a seam that needed redoing on a customer's dress and watched her do it with an assessing eye and said, "That will do," which Eudora understood to be high praise. In the evenings, Abraham came by. He did not announce it as a particular intention. He simply appeared, sometimes with a question about something, sometimes with news about the letter to Judge Fenwick, sometimes with nothing more specific than conversation. He would sit on the steps of the millinery shop, while Eudora sat on the upper step, and they would talk while the Kansas evening settled in around them, the sky going from hard blue to amber to the deep purple of a frontier night, stars arriving in great quantity the way they do on the plains where there are no hills to block the horizon. He told her about Tennessee, about the particular green of the hills there, and the way the seasons moved through them, about his mother who had taught him that a book was the best tool a person could own, and his father who had taught him that service was not a sacrifice but a privilege. He told her about the year he had spent questioning his faith before coming west, a dark year in Nashville when nothing had seemed true and everything had seemed hollow, and how he had come out the other side of it not with certainty, but with something better, with the willingness to sit in uncertainty and find that it did not destroy him. Eudora told him about Missouri, about the farm before it was lost, and the way she had loved the work of it, the specific satisfaction of planting something in the ground and watching it come up. She told him about her mother, who had been a sensible and loving woman who died of pneumonia the winter after they lost the farm, and whom Eudora missed still with an ache that had become simply part of her, like a healed break in a bone that changes the shape of the thing ever so slightly. She told him about the years after, moving from town to town and job to job, working in hotels and laundries and doing whatever came to hand, and how she had been working as a cook in a boarding house in Dodge City when she met Cole Danner. She told him about Cole Danner straightforwardly, without apology and without excessive self-reproach. She said, "He was charming and I was lonely and I thought I saw something in him that was worth following. I was wrong. It is not the worst mistake a person has made." Abraham said, "No, it is not," she said. "You are not going to tell me I should have known better." He said, "Why would I do that?" She said, "Every other person I have told has told me that." He said, "Then every other person you have told was more interested in being right than in being useful." She looked at him in the evening light, this preacher with his sleeves already rolled back and his dark hair curling in the warm air, and she thought for perhaps the dozenth time since she had walked into his church that he was one of the most genuinely decent people she had ever encountered, and that this fact was both deeply reassuring and deeply inconvenient because it made her want to be near him, and wanting things had gotten her into trouble before. She said, "Abraham." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why are you doing this? And I do not mean the coffee and the letter to the judge. I mean this, sitting here every evening talking to me." He was quiet for a moment. The crickets were starting up in the dry grass, and the saloon down the street was beginning its nightly noise, and the stars were coming in thick overhead. He said, "Because I find that I want to." She said, "That is not a safe thing to want." He said, "I know." She said, "I am a woman with a wanted poster and a history that is complicated and a name that is not clean." He said, "I am a preacher in a frontier town who talks to God about things he does not understand and tries to be useful to people who are suffering and makes coffee for strangers on Sunday mornings. I am not sure what safety has to do with any of it." She looked out at the street and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "I like talking to you." He said, "I like talking to you too, Eudora." And that was, she thought later, the moment. Not a kiss or a declaration or any of the grand gestures she had read about in the dime novels that circulated through boarding houses. Just two people on a step in the Kansas evening saying simple true things to each other. It felt, she thought, like the first honest thing she had been part of in a very long time. The letter from Judge Fenwick arrived on a Thursday, 10 days after Abraham had sent his own. It was written in a careful hand on official paper, and it said that the judge would be in Caldwell in approximately 3 weeks on his regular circuit, that he had made inquiries regarding the Wichita matter, that what he had found suggested the situation was considerably more ambiguous than the poster indicated, and that he was prepared to take a formal statement. Abraham brought the letter to the millinery shop in the middle of the afternoon, and Eudora read it standing in the middle of a pile of unboxed ribbon spools, and when she had read it twice, she set it down carefully on the counter and was silent for a long moment. Mrs. Voss, who had excellent instincts about when to make herself scarce, found a reason to be in the back room. Abraham waited. Eudora said, "He found something." Abraham said, "It appears that the Pinkerton reports from the bank robbery have more than one statement. There was a teller who gave a description of everyone who entered the bank. He described a man matching Cole Danner's description and no woman." She turned to look at him. "Why did no one say this before?" he said. "I do not know. The deputy in Wichita may not have communicated it properly, or may not have been trying to. Sometimes these things get complicated for reasons that are not flattering to the parties involved. So I have been running for 2 months because someone did not do their job." He said, "I am sorry, Eudora," she said. "Do not apologize. It is not your fault." Then after a moment, "What do I do for 3 weeks?" he said. "Exactly what you have been doing. Mrs. Voss seems to think you are reasonably useful." "High praise," she said, and he laughed, and the laugh was warm and easy, and she stored it away without meaning to, the way a person unconsciously stores things that bring them comfort. The 3 weeks that followed were the strangest, and in some ways the best weeks Eudora Rhodes could remember having. She worked in the millinery shop, and gradually became something almost indispensable to Mrs. Voss, who recognized competence in any form and rewarded it with the willingness to teach more. She learned more about the stock and the orders and the specific demands of women on the frontier who wanted beauty in their lives, even when the frontier was not particularly interested in providing it. She met women who were building lives in difficult circumstances with a resourcefulness she admired. She met cowboys who came in to buy ribbons for girls back home in Texas, sheepish and large-handed and touching in their clumsiness. She met the people of Caldwell, in other words. And Caldwell, being a cattle town at the end of the Kisham Trail, was one of the most mixed and complicated and interesting collections of people in Kansas. There were families from Ohio and Missouri and Tennessee trying to build permanent things. There were trail hands from Texas who spent a few weeks a year in town and the rest of their lives on horseback. There were people from Mexico who had come north along the trail with the cattle drives and found reasons to stay. There were freed black men and women who had come west after the war looking for a place where the rules were still being written, and who worked in every capacity, as cowboys, as business owners, as tradespeople with the particular ferocity of people who have been told they cannot, and have decided to do it anyway. Abraham moved through all of it with an easy grace that she watched and thought about. He was not naive about the injustices that the town contained. He spoke about them plainly when they came up, acknowledging that the trail hands from Texas were often treated better than the men who had driven the cattle alongside them simply because of the color of their skin, that women had no standing in the law of the territory that matched what they deserved, that the people in Indian Territory to the south had had their land and their lives rearranged by forces they had not consented to and could not stop. He did not deliver these observations as speeches. He delivered them as facts that he thought were worth knowing, as part of seeing the world clearly. She found this quality in him more attractive than she found it comfortable to admit. On the second Sunday of her stay in Caldwell, she went to church again. She sat in the back pew again, out of habit, but not out of the need for proximity to an exit. This time she sat there because she had discovered to some surprise that she liked the services, that there was something in the rhythm of them, the singing and the scripture and the sermon, that gave a shape to the week that she had been missing without knowing it. Abraham preached about honesty that Sunday, about the cost of it and the necessity of it, and the way a community cannot hold together without it, the way relationships cannot hold together without it, the way a person cannot hold themselves together without it. He said, looking out at the congregation with those steady eyes, "Honesty is not comfortable. It is not meant to be. It is the thing that happens when you care enough about a person or a situation to say the true thing even when the easier thing is available." He did not look at her when he said it, but she had the feeling, which she recognized as possibly self-flattering and could not entirely dismiss, that he was thinking about her when he did. After the service she waited while the congregation filtered out, and when he came down from the pulpit she was standing in the aisle rather than sitting in the pew, which he noticed. He said, "You are not running away today." She said, "I decided to stop running, at least for now." He said, "That is very good news." She said, "I wanted to tell you something." He said, "All right," she said, "I have been alone for a long time, not always by myself but alone, which is a different thing. And I have gotten very good at it, at managing things alone and not needing anyone and being suspicious of people who offer help because there is usually something they want in return." She stopped and looked at him steadily. "You have not wanted anything in return, and that has made me trust you more slowly than I would have trusted someone who did, because I know how to evaluate what a person wants. I do not know quite what to do with a person who simply wants to help." He was very still, listening. She said, "I wanted you to know that I see it, that I am grateful for it, and that I find you to be a remarkable person, Abraham Rourke." He said, "Eudora," she said, "you do not have to say anything." He said, "I know I do not have to. I want to." He took a step toward her, closing the distance to something more intimate, and said, "I think you are one of the bravest people I have ever met. And I think you are kind and funny and sharper than is comfortable, and I have spent the past 2 weeks looking forward to the evenings on the millinery steps the way I have not looked forward to anything in a very long time. I think you should know that." The morning light came through the plain glass windows and fell on them both in the empty church. Outside, Caldwell moved through its Sunday. Inside, it was very quiet. She said, "That is quite a thing to say." He said, "Yes, it is." She said, "What do you intend to do about it?" He said, "I intend to sit with you on the millinery steps tonight and tell you more things that are true, and we can see where that leads." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "That seems like a reasonable plan." And the smile that went with it was the fullest, least guarded smile he had seen from her, and he thought that it was possibly the most wonderful thing he had seen in Caldwell, Kansas, in 2 years of living there. That evening on the millinery steps, He told her that he had been lonely in the way that people who are surrounded by others can be lonely. That ministry was the kind of work where you gave constantly, and the giving was real and meaningful, but that there was a particular quality of being known, of being seen as a full person rather than as a function, that he had been missing without quite letting himself articulate it. He said it carefully and without self-pity, as a fact he was trusting her with. She told him that she had almost given up on the idea that she could build something real, something permanent, because every time she had started to build something it had been taken away or had fallen down, and that she had been in the process of convincing herself that the moving itself was her natural state, that she was the kind of person who did not stay. He said, "And now," she said, "now I am not sure about that." He reached over in the gathering dark and took her hand where it rested on the step beside her, not urgently, quietly, and she looked down at their hands and then looked up at him and did not move away. They sat like that for a long time, talking and sometimes not talking, while the Kansas night came in full and the stars made their great indifferent display above the plains. And it was, Eudora thought, the most peaceful she had felt in years. Judge Harold Fenwick rode into Caldwell on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, exactly as scheduled. He was a tall man of 55 with white hair and the kind of face that has been weathered by decades of living in the territory. Not unpleasant but not easy either, a face built for the work of judgment. He came with a clerk and 2 deputies and set up in the town hall, which served as the court when the circuit judge came through. Abraham brought Eudora to the town hall at the appointed time. He walked beside her through the street in full view of everyone, which was, she understood, a statement. The people who saw them nodded to Abraham, and some of them nodded to her as well, because 3 weeks was enough time in a small town to move from stranger to known quantity if you behaved yourself, and she had behaved herself, and Mrs. Voss had spoken well of her to anyone who asked. Deputy Garrett Clay was there, and he gave Eudora a nod that said he had done what he could within the constraints of what he could do. Judge Fenwick took her statement for an hour and a half. He asked precise questions and wrote precise notes and gave nothing away in his expression. He had the deposition from the Wichita bank teller, which he read to her, and which confirmed exactly what she had told Abraham, that the teller had described one man entering the bank, that no woman had been identified as a participant in the actual robbery. At the end of the hour and a half, Judge Fenwick set down his pen and looked at Eudora across the table and said, "Miss Rhodes, the charge against you as stated on the poster is a charge for questioning, not for robbery itself. Based on the testimony of the teller and the report filed by the Pinkerton man who ended the matter with Danner, I find no basis for any charge to proceed. You were associated with a man who committed a crime. Association is not participation. I am clearing your name of any formal warrant." Eudora said, very carefully, "That is what you have found." He said, "That is what the evidence shows, and I follow the evidence." He paused and then said, with the slight softening of a man who has delivered a great deal of hard news in his career and appreciates the moments when he does not have to, "You are free to go, Miss Rhodes. I would suggest staying out of Wichita for a while, not because the law requires it, but because some people are slower than the law to update their understanding." She said, "Understood." She walked out of the town hall into the Kansas sunshine, and Abraham Rourke was waiting on the steps, and she stopped in front of him and he looked at her face and he said, "Well," she said, "cleared." He let out a breath that told her exactly how concerned he had been, more than he had shown her. He said, "Eudora." She said, "I know." He said, "I am very glad." She said, "So am I then," because the relief was making her honest in ways she might have been more careful about otherwise. She said, "Abraham, I do not want to go to Nebraska." He said, "Then don't." She said, "I'm not sure what I do instead." He said, "Mrs. Voss has been talking about needing someone permanent in the shop, and Caldwell is not a large town, but it is a real one, and it is possible to build something here. People do it every day." He paused and then said with the directness that she had come to see as simply the way he was made, "I would very much like it if you stayed." She said, "Because of the shop." He said, "No." She said, "Because of the church." He said, "Not primarily." She said, "Say the thing you mean, Abraham." He said, "Because of me. Because I am asking you to stay because of me. And because I would like very much to have more time with you and to see where this goes. And I think that it could go somewhere good. And I think that you and I both deserve something good." The sun was coming down warm on the steps, and the street of Caldwell was going about its business around them. And Eudora Rhodes looked at Abraham Rourke and thought about all the things that had led her here, the bad luck and the bad choices, and the long road through dust and difficulty, and thought that possibly all of it had been necessary to arrive at this exact point. Standing on the steps of a town hall in Kansas, with a preacher who had offered her coffee without conditions, and taken her hand in the dark without urgency, and written to a judge on her behalf, and waited on the steps with his breath held, while a woman he had known for 3 weeks had her name cleared by the law. She said, "All right, Abraham." He said, "All right, you will stay." She said, "All right, I will stay." She looked at him steadily. "Do not make me regret it," he said. "I will do my very best," and the way he said it, with both the seriousness and the warmth so present that neither overshadowed the other, made her feel that his best was considerable. She took the permanent position with Mrs. Voss, who made her a fair offer, and then, when Eudora countered it with a figure that was somewhat higher, and based on a clear-eyed assessment of what she was contributing to the shop's operation, accepted the counter without argument and said, "I knew I liked you," with the satisfaction of a woman who respects a good negotiation. The evenings on the millinery steps continued, and then became evenings sometimes at the church, where Abraham had a small office that smelled of books and paper, and the particular mineral smell of the Kansas earth that came through the window, and where they would sit across from each other at his desk while he worked on sermons and she read from his bookshelves, which were extensive and eclectic, and included novels alongside scripture, alongside volumes of history and philosophy. And she discovered that reading in silence with another person was one of the most intimate things she had ever experienced, which surprised her considerably. In late June, there was a cattle drive that came through Caldwell in unusual numbers, more than 3,000 longhorns and the trail hands that went with them, and the town swelled and the noise levels rose, and the saloons did the best business of the year. There was, inevitably, trouble. There was a fight outside the Silver Dollar on a Friday night that left 2 men with broken noses and 1 with a dislocated shoulder, and there was a dispute over payment between a drover and a buyer that required Garrett Clay to mediate for most of Saturday afternoon. On that Saturday evening, Eudora found Abraham at the church. He was sitting in the front pew with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, not in prayer exactly, or at least not the kind of prayer that looks performative. He was sitting in the way of a person who needs a quiet room. She sat beside him. She did not ask what was wrong. She had learned that he would tell her when he was ready, and that sitting beside him in the meantime was its own form of useful. After a while he said, "There is a man at Doc Grayson's. A trail hand from Texas, about 20 years old. He was in the fight last night and he got cut with a knife badly enough that the doc is not sure he will make it." He paused. "He is a boy from somewhere in South Texas with no family within 500 miles, and he is possibly dying in a strange town, and I sat with him for 2 hours this afternoon and he told me about his mother's cooking." Eudora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That is hard." He said, "Yes," she said. "Is there anything to be done?" He said, "The doc will do what he can. I have told the boy I will go back in the morning, and I will." He looked sideways at her. "Sometimes there is nothing to do but be present. I know that. It does not make it easier." She reached over and put her hand on his where it rested on his knee, the same gesture he had made for her on the millinery steps, quiet and unhurried. He turned his hand and held hers. She said, "You carry a great deal." He said, "It is the work." She said, "It is the work, and it is also you. Not everyone who does this work carries it the way you do." He said, "I would not know how to do it any other way." She said, "I know." She held his hand and the church was quiet around them, and she said, more quietly, "I am glad that you are the kind of person who goes and sits with a frightened boy and listens to him talk about his mother's cooking. I want you to know that." He looked at her, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, something that was past gratitude and past simple affection, something deeper and more serious. He said, "Eudora," she said. "Yes." He said, "I love you." It came out simply, without preamble or dramatic preparation, the way true things often do when the circumstances make performance feel impossible. She looked at him in the quiet church. This man who was good in ways she had stopped believing were possible. This man who had offered her coffee without conditions and written letters to judges and sat with dying strangers and carried the weight of his community with a grace that she had come to recognize as costing him more than he let on. This man who held her hand in the dark and read in comfortable silence and said true things plainly. She said, "I love you too, Abraham Rourke." "That frightens me considerably, but it is true." He said, "I know it frightens you, it frightens me as well." She said, "You do not seem frightened." He said, "I am very good at looking steady when I am frightened. It is a professional skill." She laughed, and he laughed, and the laughter in the empty church at the end of a hard Saturday in a Kansas cattle town was one of the best things either of them had ever heard. The trail hand from Texas, whose name was Samuel, recovered. Doc Grayson, who was a competent if somewhat temperamental physician, had done good work, and Samuel was young and strong, and by the time the cattle drive moved on, he was well enough to be angry about missing the drive's departure. Abraham found him a temporary job with a local rancher to give him time to fully heal and the means to get home, and Samuel, who was Catholic and had initially regarded a Protestant preacher with mild suspicion, shook Abraham's hand with considerable feeling and said, "I owe you one, preacher," and Abraham said, "Just take care of yourself, Samuel." And that was that. By August, Eudora had been in Caldwell for nearly 5 months. She had stopped cataloging exits when she walked into rooms. She had started calling Mrs. Voss by her first name, Clara, which Clara had invited with a directness that brooked no argument. She had become a familiar figure in the town, someone people nodded to on the street and came to see about hats and ribbons, and the alteration of dresses that needed adjusting for women whose figures had changed in the demanding conditions of frontier life. She had found, to her own surprise, that she was good at the shop, not just practically, but in the human dimension of it, that she had a gift for understanding what a woman actually wanted as opposed to what she asked for, and that this gift made customers come back. She had also, over these months, become part of Abraham's life in all the ordinary ways that matter most. She sat in the fourth pew from the back on Sundays, which was her compromise between the last pew and the front, and she helped him after services when help was needed, carrying things and speaking to people, and filling in the gaps that a single-person operation inevitably had. She had dinner with him on Wednesdays at the small house attached to the church that the congregation provided for their pastor, a house that was adequately furnished and deeply in need of what Eudora privately thought of as a woman's organizational philosophy, which she began implementing with Clara Voss's assistance in the form of curtains and a proper set of kitchen shelves. Abraham noticed the changes to his house with the expression of a man who is experiencing an improvement and is trying to decide whether he should remark on it or accept it as the natural order of things. He remarked on the curtains and said they were very good. He noticed the kitchen shelves and immediately began using them properly, which Eudora noted with approval. In August, on a warm evening when the prairie sky was putting on one of its great orange and pink performances, Abraham Rourke knelt on one knee in the kitchen of his small house with a ring that had been his mother's, that he had carried west in a small wooden box and had never expected to use because he had not been looking for anyone, had not been looking because he had the particular knowledge of a person who has seen enough of the world to know that you cannot look for the real things. They have to find you. And he said to Eudora Rhodes, who was standing by the kitchen window with a dish she had been drying still in her hand. "I would like very much to spend the rest of my life with you. I would like to marry you if you will have me. I am not a wealthy man and I am not an easy one in some respects, but I love you truly, and I will try my very best every day to be worthy of you." Eudora set down the dish. She looked at this man kneeling on the kitchen floor of a small house in Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1882. This man who had said stay right there to a desperate woman in the back of his church, and had meant it with no qualification and no condition. This man who she had been falling in love with so gradually that she had not noticed it was happening until it had fully happened. This man whose hands she knew, and whose laugh she knew, and whose way of sitting in silence she knew, and whose particular brand of steady honesty she had come to depend on in ways she had not depended on another person in years. She said, "Abraham Rourke, yes. My answer is yes, and it has been yes for quite some time, but you are just now getting around to asking." He laughed, still on one knee, and she pulled him to his feet, and he put the ring on her finger, and then she kissed him, properly, with her hands on his face, and all the months of restraint and careful building and gratitude and love going into it. And he held her with his arms around her and his face in her hair. And outside the Kansas evening continued its performance, indifferent and magnificent. They were married in October, in Grace Fellowship Church, by a colleague of Abraham's who rode over from the neighboring town of Wellington for the occasion, a man named Reverend James Price, who had known Abraham since the seminary days, and who performed the ceremony with the warmth and precision of someone who understood exactly what he was witnessing. The whole congregation was there. Clara Voss in the front row with a new hat that she had made herself, Deputy Garrett Clay with his wife on his arm looking genuinely pleased, the families and the tradespeople, and some of the ranchers who had gotten to know Eudora through the shop and through the church. Eudora wore a dress that she and Clara had made together over the course of 3 weeks, a blue-gray silk the color of the Kansas sky in autumn, with a collar that was modest but elegant and buttons that were pearl rather than bone, which Clara had insisted on, and which Eudora had accepted because she had learned that some gifts are worth accepting without argument. She walked down the aisle of Grace Fellowship Church and sat in the front pew while the service opened, which was the only time in her life she sat in the front pew of anything. And then she stood and said her vows to Abraham Rourke, and he said his to her. And both of them meant every word with the full weight of people who have lived enough to know that vows are not poetry but architecture, that they are structural, that they are what a life is built on. Judge Harold Fenwick, who had been in town for the October circuit, attended as a guest. He shook Eudora's hand afterward with a formal correctness that she recognized as his version of warmth and said, "I am glad things worked out, Miss Rhodes." And she said, "Mrs. Rourke," pleasantly, and he acknowledged the correction with a slight nod that was almost a smile. The winter of 1882 settled into Caldwell with the full force of a Kansas winter, which is something that a person from Missouri or Tennessee has to experience to truly understand. The wind came off the plains with nothing to stop it for hundreds of miles, and the temperature dropped in a way that made firewood a serious matter, and the small house attached to Grace Fellowship Church, properly insulated now and fully equipped with good curtains and organized kitchen shelves, the warmest and best place Eudora had ever lived. She discovered that she loved the winter, or at least that she loved this winter. The first winter she had spent in one place with a fire she had a right to, and a man she had chosen beside her. She and Abraham would sit in the evenings after supper with a lamp between them, and she would work on something for the shop, or for the house while he worked on his sermons or read. And the silence between them was the same comfortable silence she had first discovered in his church office, but fuller now, weighted with the particular ease of two people who have committed to each other, and are discovering daily that the commitment was right. He was not perfect. She was not perfect. He had a tendency to take on too much and then be silent about it when he was overtaxed, which she had to learn to read, a particular quality of stillness in him that meant he was carrying more than he should. And when she saw it, she had to be the one to say, "Abraham, tell me." He had a frustrating habit of assuming the best of people to the point where he was sometimes taken advantage of, not maliciously but by the people who needed things and asked without considering whether the asking was fair. She had to learn not to intercept this for him, but to trust that he had his own ways of managing it. She had her own edges. She was slower to trust than was always rational, and she knew it, and she worked on it. But there were moments when her old wariness came up hard and fast in situations that did not warrant it, and Abraham had learned to recognize those moments too, and to wait them out without taking offense. She had a direct manner in situations where directness was not always welcome, which served her well in business and occasionally made social situations complicated. She did not apologize for it, but she learned to calibrate it. They managed each other's imperfections with the combination of love and practicality and humor that is the actual substance of a lasting marriage, which is less like a novel and more like good farming. Constant attention, hard work, the occasional drought, the great specific pleasure of things growing in the ground you have tended. By the following spring, Eudora knew she was expecting. She told Abraham on a morning in April in the kitchen, with the coffee just made, because she was not a woman who built toward announcements dramatically when the thing could simply be said. She said, "I am going to have a baby." He was still for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her the way he had held her on their wedding day, with both arms and his face in her hair, and she felt his chest rise and fall on a long exhale. He said, "Are you well? Do you feel well?" she said. "I feel perfectly well. A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise fine. Doc Grayson says everything is as it should be." He pulled back and looked at her, and he was smiling in a way she had never quite seen before, something in it younger, something in it that was purely happy in a way that all his other happiness had something thoughtful mixed with it. He said, "Eudora Rhodes," she said, "Abraham Rourke." He said, "We are going to have a child," she said. "We are indeed. In November, Doc Grayson thinks." He said, "November." He sat down at the kitchen table as though his legs had made a unilateral decision. He said, "I need to sit for a moment." She brought him coffee and sat across from him and watched him be happy, and was herself happy in a way that was almost startling in its completeness, a feeling that did not seem to have any corners missing, which was not something she had had much experience with. She wrote to her cousin in Nebraska, not because she needed help, but because she wanted someone in her family to know, and the cousin, whose name was Margaret, wrote back with a warmth that made Eudora understand that the family connection was more alive than she had thought, that people who care about each other can survive long distances and long silences if the care is real. The pregnancy progressed through the spring and summer without complication, which Doc Grayson attributed to Eudora's good health and general constitution, and what he called, with professional understatement, a sensible attitude. Clara Voss, who had had 2 children of her own and had the institutional knowledge that comes with that, was practically a second midwife in terms of the advice she dispensed, and Eudora, who had learned to receive gifts without discomfort, accepted it gratefully. Abraham was, throughout these months, attentive in the most useful ways, which meant that he was present and practical and did not fuss in ways that would have annoyed her. He made sure the firewood was properly stocked. He handled the heavier tasks without being asked. He read to her in the evenings when she was tired, from whatever she was currently reading, in the warm, low voice that she had come to associate with safety. He prayed with her, not in a performative way but simply, conversationally, as a man talking to someone he trusts about things that matter. On a cold morning in November in 1883, with the first real snow of the season beginning to fall outside the window of the small house attached to Grace Fellowship Church in Caldwell, Kansas, with Doc Grayson and Clara Voss in attendance and Abraham's hand in her grip, and the whole ordeal of it being exactly as difficult and transforming as it is supposed to be. Eudora Rhodes gave birth to a son. He was born healthy and loud about it, which Doc Grayson said was an excellent sign. They named him Henry James Rourke, Henry for Abraham's father, James for Reverend James Price, who had married them with such care. Abraham held his son for the first time with the careful terror of a man who has never held a newborn and is acutely aware of the responsibility of the thing, and looked at him, this small, red-faced, demanding person, and then looked at Eudora, who was tired and splendid and watching him with eyes that contained everything. He said, "He is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen." She said, "He is going to be very loud, I think." He said, "Good, the world should hear him." She said, "Abraham." He said, "Yes." She said, "Come here." He came to the bed and sat beside her, still holding Henry, and she leaned against him, and they looked at their son together in the lamplight, while the snow fell on Caldwell, Kansas, and the church sat quiet and steady behind their house, and the prairie spread out in every direction under a sky that was putting on its best winter white. She said, "I walked into your church with nothing and no name worth having and a wanted poster to my name, and now I have all of this." He said, "You walked into my church with yourself, which was already everything." She said, "You are going to put that in a sermon, are you not?" He said, "Almost certainly, yes." She laughed, softly so as not to startle the baby, and he kissed the top of her head, and Henry made a small, insistent sound that said he was not interested in the sentiment of the moment and had immediate practical requirements. And Eudora attended to the practical requirements with the same competence she brought to everything. And Abraham watched with the expression of a man who has been given more than he asked for and knows it. Clara Voss came by the next morning with food enough for a week and the satisfaction of someone who has been practically useful in an important moment. She looked at Henry with an assessing eye and said, "He has good hands. He will be good with his hands." Nobody knew what basis she had for this assessment, and nobody asked. As Henry grew through his first year, the town grew with him. Caldwell in 1883 and 1884 was in the full heat of its time as a cattle town, with the Kishom Trail bringing commerce and chaos in roughly equal measure. Abraham's congregation grew, partly through natural increase as more families settled in the area, and partly through a quality in the ministry that drew people who were not necessarily looking for doctrine, but were looking for a place that took them seriously. He baptized children and married couples and buried the dead and counseled the living, and all of it was real work that mattered. And Eudora watched him do it with a pride she did not always articulate, because she had found that he did not need her to articulate it, that he knew she saw him, and that this was enough. She ran the millinery shop, which she and Clara had, through a series of conversations and negotiations that Clara clearly enjoyed, moved toward a partnership model with Eudora having an ownership stake in exchange for the management work she had been doing anyway. The shop expanded into a second room in the spring of 1884, adding a broader range of ready-made goods alongside the custom work, and the expansion was successful. Eudora hired a young woman named Rosa, who had come to Caldwell from Mexico with her family when they moved up along the cattle trail, and who had an extraordinary eye for color and design that complemented Eudora's organizational gifts well. They had discussions about fairness in wages and about what it meant to build a business that treated people properly, discussions that Rosa engaged with a directness that Eudora appreciated because it reminded her of herself, and the result was a shop that paid fair wages and was, among the women of Caldwell and the surrounding ranches, considered the best of its kind for 50 miles. Eudora also, gradually, and with the deliberateness that characterized everything she did, became involved in the school. Caldwell had established a school in 1880, and the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Charlotte Brand, was excellent but perpetually short on resources. Eudora, drawing on the books in Abraham's considerable library, and on the skills she had accumulated over a lifetime of being without enough and making do, became a reliable source of both materials and practical support, coming in on some afternoons to help with reading groups, and discovering that she had both the patience and the sharpness that good teaching required. In 1885, she found she was expecting again. This time she told Abraham over dinner, because the first time she had told him in the morning, and she wanted a different memory for a different child. She simply said, between the biscuits and the beans, "We are going to need a larger house." He looked at her for a moment and then understood, and his face did the thing it did when something was large and good, that rearrangement she still loved after 3 years of marriage. He said, "When?" She said, "August, Doc Grayson thinks." He said, "August is a fine month." She said, "Henry will need to move to his own room." He said, "Henry will survive the adjustment." Henry, who was by then a year and a half and had strong opinions about most things that he communicated with the vocabulary available to a person of that age, which was limited but emphatic, looked up at the sound of his name and said, "Mine," which was currently his position on most topics. Abraham said, "We will discuss it," to Henry, and Eudora laughed. They built the addition to the house that spring. Abraham was not a carpenter by training but was handy enough, and 2 members of his congregation, brothers named Tom and Will Hargreaves, who were carpenters by trade, did the skilled work, while Abraham and Eudora contributed the labor that did not require carpentry knowledge. The addition was finished in June, giving Henry his own room and the house a slightly larger kitchen, which Eudora had negotiated for as a condition of the whole enterprise on the grounds that the original kitchen had never been quite adequate. On a hot August evening in 1885, Eudora Rhodes gave birth to a daughter. She was smaller than Henry had been and quieter in her first moments, which Doc Grayson said did not concern him, and then she opened her eyes and looked around with an expression of composed assessment that made Clara Voss, who was again in attendance, say, "That one is going to run things." They named her Ruth Eliza Rourke. Ruth because Eudora had always loved the steadiness of that story, the loyalty of it, "Where you go I will go." Eliza for Eudora's mother. Abraham held Ruth with the same careful wonder he had held Henry, but with somewhat less terror, experience having taught him that babies are more resilient than they appear. He said to her, in the low voice that Eudora loved, "Hello, Ruth. We have been looking forward to meeting you." Ruth regarded him with the composed assessment that would apparently define her character, and seemed, on consideration, to find him adequate. The years moved through their seasons. Caldwell changed, as frontier towns did in those years, the cattle trade beginning its slow transformation as the open range gave way to fenced ranches, and the railroads pushed further south, making the long drives up the Kishom Trail less necessary. By the late 1880s, the town was becoming less a cowboy town and more a farming town, more permanent and less wild. And while some of the old-timers lamented this, Abraham understood it as the natural progression of a place becoming itself, putting down roots in the same way individuals and families put down roots. He was offered a position at a larger church in Topeka in 1887. He and Eudora discussed it seriously, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee that had gone cold while they talked it through from every angle, the way they approached decisions of consequence. She said, "What do you want?" He said, "I think I want to stay, but I want to know what you want." She said, "I built something here. The shop is real and the school is real and the people are real. I do not want to leave." She paused. "But if Topeka is where you need to be, then Topeka is where we go." "I have learned that I can build things wherever I am." He said, "I need to be where you are, and I want to be here." He wrote to the Topeka church with thanks and declined. 2 years later, in 1889, Kansas land to the south opened further as the government continued its land negotiations, and a new wave of settlers came through Caldwell with the particular combination of hope and anxiety that defines people on the edge of something new. Abraham's congregation grew again, and the school grew, and the town expanded in the untidy way of frontier towns that are becoming something more settled. Henry was 6 years old and in Miss Brand's school, where he was demonstrating the good hands Clara Voss had predicted, and also an aptitude for mathematics that made Miss Brand speak to Eudora about it with the particular excitement of a teacher who has found something exceptional. Ruth was 4 and demonstrating the composed authority that Clara had also predicted, managing her brother and the assorted neighborhood children who came to play at the Rourke house with the efficiency of someone who has simply decided that things should go a certain way. Eudora stood one Sunday morning in Grace Fellowship Church, in what had become her pew, the fourth from the back on the left side, with Ruth beside her and Henry on the other side, and she watched Abraham stand at the pulpit with his coat off, and his sleeves rolled to his elbows as they always were because he ran warm, and she thought about the morning 7 years ago when she had come in through the back door in trail dust and desperation, and taken the last pew, and sat there calculating exits. He was preaching on joy, not happiness. He was careful to distinguish them because he had always been precise about words. Happiness was the condition of things going well, which was variable and not entirely under a person's control. Joy was something different, something that persisted even when things were not going well, that came from a settled sense of what mattered and who you were and where you belonged. He said that joy was not naive about the world's difficulty, but chose, in spite of the difficulty, to be present in the life that was actually happening rather than the life that circumstances might have provided. He looked out at the congregation as he always did, and his eyes found her as they always did, and the look that passed between them in the middle of the morning service was private and full and not for anyone else, the look of two people who have built something real together and know it. Henry tugged at Eudora's sleeve and whispered something about wanting to sit with his friend James after the sermon. She whispered back that he could. Ruth sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the pulpit with an attention that was slightly unnerving in a 4-year-old. The congregation sang the final hymn and Abraham gave the benediction with his hands raised and his voice clear and warm in the white-walled church, and the people of Caldwell moved out into the Kansas Sunday, and life continued in all its ordinary, extraordinary specificity. After the service, after the handshakes and the small conversations and the questions from congregation members that needed answering, after the children were collected and the doors checked and the small administrative tasks that closed a Sunday service, Abraham found Eudora in the kitchen behind the vestry. She was making coffee because she had taken over this particular function somewhere in the past several years, and it had simply become the shape of things. He came and stood beside her at the stove, and she handed him a cup and he took it, and they stood together in the small kitchen with the dried lavender hanging above the window, which she had replaced once a year since she first noticed it, maintaining the thing that had been someone's good idea before she arrived. He said, "Good morning, Mrs. Rourke." She said, "Good morning, Abraham." He said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "7 years ago, that Sunday." He said, "When you walked in." She said, "When I walked in." She looked at the lavender. "I was so tired and so certain that nothing good was coming." He said, "And now," she turned to look at him, this man she had chosen and who had chosen her, in this kitchen in Kansas, with 2 children in the churchyard playing in the morning sun and a life that was real and hers and built from scratch. She said, "And now I am the most fortunate person I know, which is not something I say lightly." He set down his coffee and took her face in his hands carefully, the way he held things he valued, and said, "You walked into the back of my church on a Sunday morning and I told you to stay." She said, "And I stayed." He said, "Best sermon I never preached." She laughed, and the laugh filled the small kitchen and went out through the window into the Kansas morning where her children were playing, and the cottonwood trees were moving in the wind, and the prairie stretched out in every direction under a sky that was as wide and clear and indifferent as ever. And all of it, the sky and the wind and the land and the life she had built in it, was true and solid and entirely, completely hers. She put her hands over his where they held her face and looked at him with the full warmth that she had once kept so carefully guarded, that she had learned with him to give freely. She said, "I love you, Abraham Rourke. Every day I love you." He said, "Every day, Eudora Rhodes, for all of them." And that was the truest thing either of them had ever said, and they meant it in the way of people who have earned it, not by being lucky or easy or uncomplicated, but by choosing each other deliberately and consistently, day after ordinary extraordinary day, in a small house in Caldwell, Kansas, at the end of the Kishom Trail in the last years of the frontier, when the world was still new enough that two people with enough courage could build something that would last. Outside, Henry called for his mother in the bright voice of a 6-year-old, with something urgent to show her. Eudora stepped back from Abraham's hands and picked up her coffee and went to the window and called back that she was coming, and Ruth's voice joined her brother's, demanding and composed, and Abraham watched his wife go to the door of the vestry kitchen with the particular look of a man who has been given everything he needed and knows it with his whole self. The lavender moved in a draft from the window. The coffee was warm. The church was quiet and solid around them. The same white-painted walls and plain glass windows. The same last pew at the back where a tired woman in trail dust had once sat calculating exits, which was now, in the way of things that have been transformed by love, simply the last pew in the back of the church where the shadows pooled long on Sunday mornings, and the doors let in the Kansas air when they opened, and let people in.